In this video, I want to talk about the basic terrain shaping tools that you have access to when sculpting out the look of your terrains. Now, there are three of these available. We have the Raise and Lower tool. Now, to access these, just to drive this home, you need to make sure you have your terrain selected and take a look over inside your inspector, and you'll get access to all these. We have Raise and Lower the terrain, we have Set Terrain Height, and we have Smooth.
Now, aren't there hotkeys that go with these?
There are indeed, and they are associated with the Shift key. So if we hit Shift Q, that is going to grab our Raise and Lower tool. Shift W is Set Height, and Shift E is going to be Smooth. Now, even though we haven't talked about the rest of the tools, I will say that the rest of the tools follow this pattern. So all of the little tool buttons you see here inside the inspector can be accessed with Shift Q, W, E, R, T, and Y. You can just kind of march across. So at first, until you get used to where they are, just hit Shift and one of those buttons and then kind of march your way over to the one you want. That's how I learned them.
The thing to note, though, there is one exception to the hotkey. The very last button is a settings option,
right.
And it's not really a tool, so it doesn't have a hotkey.
That's right. Okay, so starting off with Raise and Lower the terrain. This is really basic, very simple. We have a brush, and with this tool active, we can paint down a raised area by dragging with the left mouse button. And if we hold down the Shift key and drag, we can push areas down. Now, currently, my terrain is at its lowest possible elevation here in the flat areas, and so all I can do is really push these areas back down.
Right. If you remember, we're talking about height maps. Height maps are a texture that go from black, which is the lowest possible height, to white, which is the highest. And right now, as he's painting, he's taking a black texture and actually painting gray to white on it.
But what I can do, if you know for a fact that your terrain needs to go up in some areas and needs to go down in others, you can grab another tool here inside the terrain menu called Flatten Height Map. And what this will do is allow you to flatten your height map at a specific elevation. All you got to do is punch in the elevation you want. So if I set this to 100 meters, that's 50% of the overall height of my terrain. So from here, we could go 100 meters down or 100 meters up, and go ahead and click Flatten. My terrain actually did jump up into the air. And now as I use the Raise and Lower Terrain tool, I can lift up in some areas, I can hold down Shift, and I can push down in others. And I can continue to pull up until I eventually hit that 100-meter plateau, and I can continue to push down until I hit the bottom, like so. Now, there are some settings for this Raise and Lower tool. First off, we can choose the shape of the brush we'd like to paint with, and don't forget about this. It's real easy to overlook. You might be thinking, oh, well, why would you ever want to do that? This brush I have is great. But like grabbing some of these texture brushes can really help get some much more natural effects as you start to play with them. So don't rule these out. Of course, I mean, and who hasn't ever wanted a star-shaped landform somewhere in your terrain? Now, down from here for Raise and Lower, we have brush size and we have opacity. Brush size is pretty straightforward. The bigger your brush, the bigger it's going to appear. So there we go. So I can paint a great big star as opposed to a really tiny little star that's so little it doesn't even really show up. So there you go. Now, this has not much to do with the actual tool itself, but I thought I would throw this out there. If you're painting from really far away, what you're painting might look pretty bad. That's because your terrain automatically simplifies the further you get from it. That's the reason why when you're painting, things look really good when you're laying your stroke down, and then as soon as you let off the mouse, they seem to chunk up a little bit. It's because while you're painting, it's showing that highest possible resolution, and then it switches over to the more optimized version as soon as you let go of the mouse. So just please keep that in mind. Now, opacity is a little bit different. This just controls how much of that raising and lowering behavior you're going to get from your brush stroke. So at a default of 50, you see about how quickly that goes up while I paint. If I crank this all the way up to 100, we go up a whole lot faster. I strongly advise that you leave this as low as you can get away with and steadily build up your brush strokes. It will cause things to look a lot nicer overall. Now, that is the Raise and Lower. Again, you drag to raise, hold down Shift, and drag to lower. Very straightforward. Now, what I'm going to do is jump back over here to Flatten Height Map, and we'll set this back to 100, and flatten back out. This is kind of like the mass reset button. Now, next to this, we have Set Terrain Height. This is very much like the Raise and Lower tool, except you don't really have to, you don't have to hold shift to push down, because what you get is a height slider that allows you to set a specific altitude. Now, there's another way to set altitude I'll talk about here in just a moment. For now, let me set the height to something like, I don't know. We're kind of defaulted at 100. Let's try 150. And now, as I paint with my brush,
your opacity is set really low, so you're applying it in stages.
That's right. So if I put this all the way up to 100%, we go straight up to our altitude.
Right. Now, there's a neat little trick where Zach was mentioning we don't use shift in this tool as far as pushing back down. What shift does with this tool is it lets you sample heights at a certain location.
So what I could do, let me just grab the raise and lower tool. And just as a random example, let's say I'm painting, I'm having all kinds of fun over here, and let's say I need to have a little more fun. And I'm thinking, this altitude right here on the side of this hill, I need to know exactly how tall that is. I can hold down shift and click right there, and that's at 121.5497. So now, when I paint with this tool at 100% opacity, we're going right to that altitude.
Yep. It makes it very easy if you need to put in a terrace or a plateau at a certain height, and you've got your map already painted, but you want it to be at that specific height without having to do a lot of guesswork. You can sample at that point and go ahead and paint in your terrace or whatever it is.
That's right. Now, keep in mind, this height slider is going to take your terrain's height value into account. So at max, it goes to 200. In my case, at min, it goes down to 0, but that's because of that terrain height I established earlier. So if I set this down to around 50 and I paint, we push down to an altitude of 50, and I can set it down to 25 and push down something underneath that. So again, very straightforward. It just allows you to paint to a set altitude. Also remember to take your other brushes into account, because you can get some really wicked effects this way. Like if I set this back to 120, see, now I can paint the same kind of thing, like a little plateau, but it looks a lot more natural around the edges if you wanted something like a desert area with the buttes all around the place. Now, the next sculpting tool I want to show is the smooth tool. This is really basic. What this does, it just smooths out any features that you have. And the amount of smoothing is based off of your opacity. So here at 100%, I mean, I'm just smoothing the daylight out of it. It's like melting everything. That might be a little bit much for what you have in mind, though, so all you got to do is turn your opacity down, and you can add just a little bit of smoothing as opposed to, melting half of your feature away.
It's a good way to come back and clean up some jagged looking edges, and if you keep your opacities low and you build up in stages, you can come back and smooth in stages, and it gives you a much more organic feel to your landscape.
It can also help, like here I've got these two terrace levels, and if I need to make a transition in between the two so a player could run up them without them acting like a wall, then I can just steadily paint on some smoothing and eventually get to a point where the player can ride right up that. So, it's, again, a nice way to control your features. And of course, brush size at this point is going to be pretty standard and self-explanatory. So those are the sculpting tools you have at your disposal. Again, you've got the ability to raise and lower your altitude, the ability to set a particular altitude and paint that down, as well as the ability to smooth out any features that you have created. That is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks for watching.